There is a kind of work that leaves almost no record behind, and that is the work that was done well. A house that was warm, a meal that appeared, clothes that fit and were clean. Nobody wrote any of it down because there was nothing to write. It had simply happened, the way it happened yesterday and would happen tomorrow. I have spent years reading what American households left behind in paper. Ledgers, recipe cards, letters, the margins of catalogs. And what comes through is a body of knowledge that was enormous, entirely undocumented, and held almost exclusively by women who would have been surprised to hear it called knowledge at all. 12 of those things today. Most of them took years to learn and about 2 generations to lose. The last one on this list is not a skill exactly. It is the thing all the others were in service of, and it is the one that has vanished most completely of all. Let us begin. 1935 to place us. 6 years into the Depression. Roughly 1 American worker in 5 without a job, and a great many of the rest on short hours. Which meant that in an enormous number of households, the difference between getting by and not getting by was not what came in, it was what was done with it once it arrived. That work fell to the woman of the house, and it was work, not metaphorically. A washing day was 8 hours of physical labor. Bread was made 2 or 3 times a week. Food was grown, preserved, and stretched. Clothes were made, mended, remade, and mended again. None of this was thought remarkable, and almost none of it was written down. It was passed from mother to daughter by standing next to each other for 15 years, which is precisely why it disappeared so fast when the standing next to each other stopped. Number 12. Baking bread without a recipe. Not from a book, from the hand. Bread in 1935 was made by judgment, because there was nothing stable enough to measure against. The flour varied by sack. The kitchen might be 60 degrees or 85, depending on the stove and the season, and dough behaves entirely differently at each. So the knowledge was not a set of quantities, it was a set of sensations. What the dough should feel like under the heel of the hand. When it has been worked enough, which you know by the way it stops sticking and starts pushing back. What proved dough looks like when it is ready, and what it looks like when it has gone a few minutes too far and will collapse. That is not teachable from a page. It was taught by standing at a table beside somebody for years, being corrected. A woman of 30 could walk into an unfamiliar kitchen with unfamiliar flour and produce bread. Not follow a recipe, produce bread. Number 11. Turning a collar. A man's shirt collar wears out long before the shirt does. It goes at the fold, where it rubs the neck, and once it is frayed, the shirt looks finished. So it was not finished. The collar was unpicked from the shirt, turned over so the worn edge faced inward and the good side faced out, and sewn back on. Done properly, it was invisible, and it bought another year or two out of a shirt. The same logic ran through the whole wardrobe. Cuffs were turned. Sheets that had worn thin in the middle were cut down the center, and the two outer edges, which were still sound, were sewn together to make a new middle. Sides to middle, it was called. I find this one a good measure of the era, because it is not a repair anybody would think of, unless the alternative was genuinely out of reach. And for a great many households, it was. Number 10. Rendering fat and keeping it. The grease jar sat by the stove in essentially every American kitchen, and it was not laziness. It was inventory. Fat from cooking was strained and kept, and it was then used for frying, for pastry, and for soap. Nothing that could be rendered was thrown out. Trimmings from meat went into a pan and came out as usable fat and a handful of cracklings that somebody ate immediately. During the war, a few years later, this became formalized, with households collecting fat and turning it in. But the habit was already there. It had been there since the Depression, and for most families, since well before that. What is worth noticing is that this was a manufacturing process running inside a domestic kitchen. A raw material was collected, processed, stored, and converted into 2 or 3 different products. Nobody called it that. It was just what you did with the pan. Number 9. Getting through a full washing day. Monday in most households, and it took the whole of it. The sequence was fixed, and it was heavy. Water heated on the stove in a copper or a boiler. Whites boiled. Everything scrubbed by hand or run through a wringer, which is a device that will take a finger off if attention wanders. Rinsed, sometimes twice. Blued to keep the whites from yellowing. Starched where starch was wanted. Wrung again, carried out wet, and wet laundry is astonishingly heavy. Hung, brought in, and then Tuesday was ironing. The judgment inside all that is the part that gets forgotten. Which fabrics could take the boiler and which could not? How much starch, which varies by garment? Whether the weather would hold long enough to be worth starting at all, decided by looking at the sky at 6 in the morning and being right. Get that last one wrong, and the entire day's work came in damp at nightfall and had to be done again. Number 8. Ironing with flat irons, which is Tuesday, and it is a job that no longer exists in any recognizable form. The irons were solid metal, and they were heated on the stove. Several at once, because a hot iron cools quickly, and you work in rotation, swapping the cooling one back onto the heat and taking up the next. There is no dial. The temperature is judged by holding the iron near the face, or by touching it briefly with a wetted finger and listening. Too cool, and it does nothing. Too hot, and it scorches the cloth, and a scorch does not come out. Everything was ironed: shirts, sheets, tablecloths, handkerchiefs, underclothing. Not out of fussiness, but because fabric came off the line stiff and creased, and that was how it was made wearable again. A woman got through a household's washing with 3 irons, a stove, and a running estimate of metal temperature, made entirely by feel. Number 7. Making soap. Fewer households by 1935 than a generation earlier, but still a great many, particularly rural ones. It was the fat from a moment ago, combined with lye, in the right proportion, and worked until it came together. The proportion mattered a great deal, and the whole process was genuinely hazardous, which everybody involved knew and worked around carefully. The finished soap was cut into bars and cured for weeks before use. It was not luxurious. It was strong and plain, and it did the work. What strikes me about it is where it sits in the chain. The household kept an animal, or bought meat. The fat came off that. The fat became soap. The soap washed the clothes on Monday. There was no point at which the household went out and bought a thing to make the next thing happen. It ran on its own output. Number 6. Cutting a dress from a flour sack. Flour, sugar, and feed came in cotton sacks, and by the 30s, the companies had worked out what was happening to the sacks afterward. So they started printing them. Florals, checks, small repeating patterns. Some included the pattern pieces printed on the sack itself. The dye on the brand label was made to wash out, which it had not previously been, and this was advertised. A woman shopping for flour was, quite openly, also shopping for fabric. Neighbors traded sacks to assemble enough matching material for a dress, since one sack was not enough. Children's clothes, aprons, curtains, quilt tops. I include this one because it is the clearest case of a household skill being large enough to change what a national industry did. The companies did not print those sacks out of kindness. They printed them because it sold flour. Number 5. Putting up the winter's food. Weeks of it, through the late summer, in a kitchen that was already unbearably hot. Picking, washing, peeling, packing, processing, sealing, labeling, carrying down to wherever the household kept things cool. Hundreds of jars in a household that did it properly. The knowledge involved was substantial, and it was exact. Which foods could be handled which way, how long, at what heat, what a properly sealed jar looks and sounds like as against one that has failed. And a failed jar was not a small matter, which everybody understood, and which is why the checking was done carefully and why the doubtful ones were set aside. The arithmetic behind it was simply survival arithmetic. What went into jars in August was what got eaten in February. A household that put up too little had a thin winter and knew it in advance, from about October, watching the shelf. Number 4. Cooking one animal for a week. A roast on Sunday, and then the week descended from it in a fixed order that most households followed without discussing. Sliced cold on Monday, something built out of the smaller pieces on Tuesday, minced or hashed by midweek, the bones into stock, and the stock into soup, and the soup stretched with whatever the garden had. That is a planning problem, and it was solved in the head days in advance every week for a lifetime. What gets used when, what has to be kept cool and for how long, What can be added to make it go further without anyone at the table noticing that it is going further? Nothing was thrown away, and that was not a virtue anybody claimed credit for. It was the plan. There was no other plan. Number 3, stretching the grocery money. A fixed amount, usually cash, usually not enough. The work was continuous mental arithmetic against shifting prices. What was cheap this week? What could substitute for what? Where a few cents could be found and where they could not. And the accounts kept afterward in pencil, to the cent, so that the same decisions could be made better next week. I have read a great many of these household ledgers. The entries are astonishingly small. Thread, 2 cents. Soap, a stamp. And they are added up every week by hand correctly. We have devices now that could tell us instantly where every dollar went. Somehow we know considerably less about it than a woman with a pencil did in 1935. Number 2, remaking children's clothes out of adults. A worn coat was not a worn coat. It was material. It was unpicked at the seams, the sound parts identified, and a smaller garment cut from them. Adult trousers became children's trousers. A dress became a smaller dress, and then, later, an apron. Wool was unraveled from a finished jumper and knitted again into something else. The skill here is not sewing exactly. It is seeing the second garment inside the first before anything is cut, and being right about it, because a wrong cut cannot be undone. Every household had somebody who could look at a ruined coat and say what it would become. That is a designer's skill, exercised weekly, unpaid, by women who would have laughed at being called one. Number 1, making it all look like nothing. And here is the one I mentioned at the start. Every skill on this list was performed so that it would not be noticed. The turned collar was invisible. The stretched meal was not supposed to taste stretched. The dress made from a flour sack was made carefully enough that it read as a dress. The entire craft was aimed at producing a household that appeared ordinary and comfortable, in a decade when a great many of them were neither. Children in these houses have said over and over in later life that they did not know at the time that the family was poor. That was the achievement, not the bread or the jars or the soap, the concealment of the effort behind all of it, which is also, of course, why almost none of it was recorded. Work that succeeds by being invisible leaves no trace when it stops. And this stopped inside 2 generations, and hardly anybody noticed it going. 12 things, then, and none of them written down at the time, because the women doing them did not consider any of it worth the paper. I am not going to tell you it was a better life. It was a great deal of very hard work, mostly unpaid and mostly unacknowledged, and I doubt many who lived it would want it back. But it was knowledge, real, detailed, hard-won knowledge, held by millions of people, transmitted by standing beside each other, and gone within about 50 years of the standing stopping. That is what I keep finding in the paper. Not nostalgia, just a great deal of skill that nobody thought to write down. I am Harlan Fenwick. The Almanac continues.